We started with history, and history is important because context matters. Without really knowing the context, it's very difficult for us to make sense. And context matters more when with history we have also modesty, because modesty also matters for us to be able to enter into subjects that sometimes are complex without having the arrogance that we already know it all. And we had Malin using the word scavenger, which was just a proof of modesty, because in fact a lot of what we have in the short history of Mozambique that was introduced today tells us elements that are absolutely indispensable for us to interpret some of the most complex phenomena that we addressed towards the end of the day. As Malin mentioned, 43 years after independence, it is time for us to start looking into the colonial parenthesis he called longue durée dimension has to prevail. And I think it is a parenthesis in the sense that even before the colonial regime could claim territorial control and administration of the same, we had already manifestations of what he called agency. And immediately he got into controversy with the African agency concept. Controversy because this is a concept that somehow has to be linked to some degree of territoriality. Using the proposal from Patrick Chabal, late Patrick Chabal, on norms of African culture alone, to explain that Africans are not passive, that they are not just victims, they are also actors of their own history, may be not enough for us to be able to justify the use of African agency. Maybe it will be enough to use agency, but if we call it African, we enter into a much more complicated territory. Because for us to have an agency, we need to have an agenda. If there is an African agenda, like Pan-Africanism ideology, it's an African agenda, then we can talk about African agency, I guess, because we are referring to the continental dimension. And in fact, Pan-Africanism, not by coincidence, was established by the diaspora precisely because they couldn't identify with specific local realities. And it was easier for the diaspora to put everything into a continental perspective that they didn't know much. The moment you get into the details and the complexities of the local, it is a much more difficult fabric to understand. And I think that's why the idea of agency linked to agenda will put to rest, I guess, some of the tension that we saw on the definition offered by Malin, because in fact it is true that there is agenda and agency in the history of Mozambique and in the history of every other territory in Africa. I'm using the word territory because sometimes the notion that these are countries is rather recent. But, we can go back and identify some similarities with the situations that are also present in other regions of the world. And when we get into the understanding of this absence of territoriality in some of the discussions, we try to put our fingers into an issue that in fact is a very complex one, which is the issue of power relations. And that's really what defines a lot of the interactions that we are talking about. And the power relations, for instance, between a donor and the recipient, the way we have witnessed, and I'm looking at Joe, have not been necessarily in favor of the recipients because of the weight of that intervention. That doesn't mean the other side is passive necessarily. But you go into dimensions of ethnicity, languages, region, even religion, which was covered towards the end of the session, namely the words of Zenaida about let's not stigmatize what is going on in terms just of a religion frame. And then we realize that all these subunits, these different ways of classifying the problems we use sometimes just for convenience. but they are fluid and very difficult for us to pinpoint, except to say that indeed power relations influence everything. And when we look into the situation of Mozambique, we have some anomalies that we would like to understand better, paradoxes, like for instance, huge amounts of aid, someone said, and yet, no results, or growth that was quite consistent for over a decade, and yet increased poverty. What explains these paradoxes? Chris suggested inequality is a good entry point, and that was referred over the day many times by many of the speakers. In the case of Novunga, he saw it more in terms of the state capture, rent-seeking behavior. And from that perspective, he said, well, there is not much appetite for accountability and transparency because that's what allows state capture to work the way it does. Joe mentioned, yes, but there is the donor dimension yet again. Victor came with the debt situation being what it is because of weak governance, and I teased him by saying, well, that's a code word for corruption. And in fact, when we look into state capture from these different angles, what comes out is that it's all linked with poor governance, it's all linked with fragility of the institutions. Individuals tend to have a much bigger size in terms of the history of their country's territories if the institutions have a smaller size in terms of their efficiency. And what we had as a beginning of a discussion about developmental state, what is happening in countries like Rwanda, is just a manifestation of that wish by many Africans to have a much more well-functioning administration, a management of the process of development that is tantamount to what some have classified as developmental state. And yet what we have, most of the cases, and it is also true for Mozambique, is alienation by different categories of economic actors and citizens. And in the case of Mozambique, Novunga was mentioning, yes, Frelimo has alienated Renamo, has alienated the people. And this is all, in his words, because there is no clear strategy of inclusiveness and there is no developmental agenda that frames the debate. He even asked, where is the 2025 agenda? Where is it? It has disappeared. So we are dealing with forms of political representation that are being questioned from different perspectives. And if we go back to the history of Mozambique, yes, there was a role of the Protestant churches and the Lutherans and other churches that have created an ethos on the part of some members of what then was the beginning of the elite and now have become the elite, that made them use a certain way of doing things that was based on norms, on rules, on methods that explain part of the history of the elite behavior in Mozambique. When it was socialism, they wanted to do socialism the right way, respecting everything, going all the way to maybe joining Comecon. When it was neoliberal, they wanted to do neoliberal the right way, going all the way to become more neoliberal than everybody else. And I think Tanya put her finger with, one specific demonstration of how training people just on methods and norms, in this case it was the German Democratic Republic norms, had resonance with those who have absorbed that type of input. But we could have talked also about the Mozambican workers that went for GDR to work in factories there because of labor scarcity in GDR. Same type of situation that explains the need for Mozambique to constantly try to align with global trends. That was referred by Antonio Matonje, the ambassador, because of this desire to be part and to be integrated in a larger experiment that Mozambique always wants to lead in terms of, being a good actor, being a good soldier, being a good student. And sometimes, this backfires. Like, for instance, there was this idea from the Gebuza Frelimo that maybe it could settle the the problems with Renamo with military intervention, because he believed also that the military could do the right thing, but they don't. They were ineffective, as it was demonstrated by Alex's presentation, and that explains in part why there was failure in trying to resolve this conflict in different, more harsh ways. And eventually there was a realization that there was a need for something else that was explained to us in detail by Alex in terms of the study that is being done about elite bargaining. The issue at stake continues to be the same: respect for diversity. Eric pointed out different ways of doing that. The issue of democratic experiment not responding necessarily to political representativeness, because, you know, elections have not resolved the problems. The fact that there is a difficulty in accessing resources and people try to struggle to get some of the public resources, and if not, you know, they can move into other forms of trying to seek income that may be classified as illegal. But Zenaida was just reminding us that there's nothing illegal about people, you know, doing artisanal mining, for instance, as a good example of how people struggle. And we have, of course, with this elite bargaining, many possibilities to finally get to a solution of one of the most intractable difficulties that we have faced so far. But then immediately we moved into Cabo Delgado, and how, through the explanations of Zenaida and Eric, we are really far from resolving the bigger problem. And the bigger problem continues to be respect for diversity. And this is complicated by the fact that poverty and the paradoxes of economic development in Mozambique are accelerating thanks to the Dutch disease. Now, the Dutch disease, for those who remember the expression, was linked to gas discoveries in the Netherlands, in Groningen. And it's very interesting because in the case that gave the expression some prominence, it was about huge inflows of foreign currency that came as a result of exploiting the richness. In the case of Mozambique, it was even more ambitious. It started spending before it was actually exploited. And that created a fiscal crisis that Victor diagnosed for us. And of course, it is very much linked, this Victor, to not only the way the macroeconomic management was done, but also by the fact that there is a very poor capability on the part of the Mozambique administration to actually diagnose anything. Because if you don't have your national accounts up to date, which is the case, if you don't have your land ownership registry up to date, which is the case, and if your census is not up to date, which is the case, you don't know your territory, you don't know your people, you don't know your economy. So you diagnose on the basis of what others say. Here comes the Washington Consensus, because what others say is basically coming from mostly financial institutions like the IMF. The IMF was really cheated in Mozambique because they could not see these loans when in fact, you know, they have all the apparatus to be able to trace external operations as a compensation for very poor statistics. That's how you do it. It's with your external dimensions that you try to compensate for lack of knowledge about the internal domestic national accounts type of production of statistics. And that's why they felt really insulted that, you know, they could discover this and this was hidden from them. And it comes also in the fact that, you know, a bank with the credibility of Credit Suisse did not do what you do, your job, risk analysis. So they just were in the deal for themselves and couldn't care less about what would be the real risk dimensions. And all of this tells us what? Tells us that, you know, in fact, we can go on about the details of macroeconomic management in Mozambique, but at the end of the day, what we are dealing with is the incapability of the state to administer its macroeconomics, linked with interests of rent-seeking that are provoked by corruption, but also some complicity on the part of external actors that, hide from Mozambique information that they may possess, or when they use it for their own interests and for their own agenda. So we are really facing many challenges. They have been mentioned by most of the interventions. And I would conclude by saying that if we really want to do the right things in Mozambique, in accordance to all the presentations that have been made, we are talking about, yes, this elite bargaining working. We are talking about urban restless youth having jobs and having their problems addressed. We are talking about diversity being respected. We are talking about marginalized regions being more integrated in the national fabric. We are talking about Mozambique being attentive about competition from its neighbors. If it wants really to make it, it has to take into account that the global value chains and all different characteristics that are influencing Africa's economic growth are, being developed and are taking place under competition, so other countries can take advantages, such as Tanzania on the gas. So we are basically saying that Mozambique is running out of time. Mozambique has to do all these things very quickly. So the expression that captured this the best was from you, Alex, strategic patience. That's what we need. Thank you.